Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. When you deeply consider the world we live and operate within, there's probably one word that best captures it all: change. Humans have this fascinating knack for evolving and adapting ourselves to best suit our surroundings, conditions, and demands put upon us. And look no further than the rise of tech and what that has meant to so many facets of life and living. IT has all but reorganized the workplace, the systems, and customs attached to it all. Now, healthcare would be another sector in which we've come to reinvent the wheel as far as practice and administration is concerned. Heck, some might even consider the transformations taking shape across many industries right now related to the climate crisis as the latest example of change. Impressive, right? Yeah, it probably is. However, acknowledging all of this makes my next point all the more confounding. Why is it that much of our mainstream educational practice in schools the world over still largely follows a set of principles, beliefs, and customs that were instilled at the onset of the 19th century? Arguably, such philosophies and practices do not align with present-day student or societal needs. Well, on today's show, I have a guest who is equally concerned by our lack of educational progress, but granted, he has actually been doing something about it. We'll hear more about his work and even his take on solutions to this critically important problem. All right, welcome to the show. So, John Tan is the Singapore-based CEO and founder of Doyobi, an impact-driven, metaverse-based EdTech company that focuses on skill building for children aged 8 to 13 through collaborative problem solving. Now, the aim of this company is to inspire children to become curious, self-directed learners, original thinkers, and to lead a life with a sense of purpose. However, John Tan represents much more than just his latest venture. He's also quite busy with many other activities, including and not limited to the following. And get this: CEO, co-founder of Singapore-based program Saturday Kids, which is the program manager of Code in the Community, the largest free coding program in Singapore. Code in the Community is supported by Google and the Singapore government. Board of Director for NinjaVan, a logistics company with nearly 60,000 employees, which leverages cutting-edge technology-enabled delivery systems to serve markets in Southeast Asia. NinjaVan went through Series E funding, raising $578 million. Board member of Erutify, a company with a mission to help Southeast Asian students stay in school by giving them affordable financing options. Headquartered in Singapore with operations in Indonesia and the Philippines, the startup has raised $5 million in Series A funding. Erutify currently works with more than 50 universities and vocational schools in Indonesia and the Philippines. And John is also an active investor, and so much so, he has invested in over 80 companies via his activity and involvement as a partner at 8 Capita, an early and growth stage angel funding company, which makes investments in profitable companies, and partner at BWB Ventures, an early stage VC fund with a focus on Y Combinator-backed startups. Furthermore, John is also an Obama Leader for Asia Pacific. This is a program under the Obama Foundation Leaders Program that seeks to inspire, empower, and connect emerging leaders from across the APAC region. Now, finally, and perhaps most meaningful to John, is that he's a family man through and through in being a father of 5. So with all that stated, John, it's an absolute honor to welcome you to the program. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah. It's an honor to have you on. And I think even during the pre-recording, I've referenced this a couple times. You sound like a busy guy outside of having 5 children, all that you're involved with. Yeah. I do appreciate you taking some time to join the program. So
Thanks.
with all of that in mind, maybe we can just jump right into it. I have the first segment lined up, and it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. Now, as my guests know, it's basically a segment where I read off a definition of the guest profession. I do it for a few reasons. One, it brings everybody up to speed on what the profession is all about or what the work is all about. And another reason, too, I think it's just we as individuals, professionals, we put our own stamp on things, and what you're doing could be completely different to another person who holds the exact same title. So I think it's a nice starting point for the discussion. And then also lastly too, I mean, sometimes Wikipedia is just flat out off on the definition of the reading. So it's also interesting in that sense. Now, what I have done here for you, I put you down for two definitions here that I think are relevant to the talk. And this might be the first time within the Life as a podcast that a guest has received two definitions from Wikipedia. But if that's all right with you, I'm just going to read off one, being an entrepreneur, and two, we're going to go with the industry of EdTech. Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, here we go. So entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is an individual who creates and or invests in one or more businesses, bearing most of the risks and enjoying most of the rewards. The entrepreneur is commonly seen as an innovator, a source of new ideas, goods, services, and businesses or procedures. Kind of short and sweet on that one. Very general also. Now, let me just read off the EdTech one too. So EdTech, educational technology, commonly abbreviated as EdTech, is the combined use of computer hardware, software, and educational theory to facilitate learning. It is often referring to the industry of companies that create educational technology. In addition to practical educational experience, educational technology is based on theoretical knowledge from various disciplines such as communication, education, psychology, sociology, artificial intelligence, and computer science. It encompasses several domains, including learning theory, computer-based learning, online learning, and mobile learning. That one was a bit of a mouthful, but first take, what do you think, John?
Well, so I think an entrepreneur is a builder, somebody who builds things, starting with a product or a service, and then having a vehicle to do that. So they end up building a company as well, right?
Yeah.
So that to me is a straightforward definition of what being an entrepreneur is. It's about building and building with a purpose.
Yeah.
And being very clear about who you are building for and why you are building it. And that's actually something that we are helping kids learn through Doyobi. So we have a quest that is focused on entrepreneurship, right? And I wanted to go way beyond the classics of lemonade stand and figuring out how much the lemons cost, the rental of the stand, and figuring out your gross profit. I think it's a lot more than that. And with young people, I think what's really, really important is to get them into that maker and builder mindset.
Well said. Well said. In terms of, I guess, the EdTech definition itself, I know that one's a bit wordier, but what did you think of that?
Well, I think it's about using technology to scale the impact that education can have. And specifically for me, it is about unlocking the originality and creativity of kids and young people. And I think maybe that's what's missing in the world right now. And my beef with EdTech in general is that a lot of EdTech is still focused on doing what school's doing, but doing it better, right? So focus on helping kids with standardized tests and with academic help. But to what end, I think is the question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think it's going to be one that we're going to be exploring quite thoroughly in this talk. I'm glad you brought that up early. In terms of just really quickly getting a rough idea on a typical day or week for you in your world, I don't even know if such a thing exists with all the activities that you're involved in, but yeah, maybe on the Doyobi side.
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I do at Doyobi is actually, well, educating parents on why what we do is important and why we deserve their time and their kids' time, because it's rarely about the money, right? It's not the fees that the parents cannot afford. It's the time. And kids are generally way overshadowed because parents believe that in order for their child to be successful in future, what matters most today is doing well in school. And doing well in school in a society like Singapore and not just limited to Singapore, is basically topping the class, right? Or topping the school. So it's all about academic performance. And
Yeah,
what I'm trying to tell parents is that academic achievements mean very little in the real world,
mm,
because I'm an entrepreneur myself and I hire, right? And I've invested in a bunch of startups, and I speak to these founders. And when I ask them what they hire for, nobody ever says, "Oh, I'm looking for someone who taught her geography class," or like, "I'm
yeah,
looking for someone who is really good with like chemistry." Like, it never happens, right?
right.
So typically, what they would say will be things like, "I'm looking for problem solvers. I'm looking for people who can reason from first principles. I'm looking for people who can collaborate and work together as a team. I'm looking for creative folks, right, who can apply creativity to help the company solve problems." And these are all life skills or transferable skills, or 21st century skills, whatever you want to call them. The
Mhm.
point is that school is not helping kids learn these skills.
That's right.
And oftentimes parents will say, "Oh, but these are skills that my child will learn eventually." And my question would be, eventually when? And if
Right.
they are so important, why aren't you helping them learn it now? Because it's not skills that apply only when they get out to the real world, right?
Yeah,
Critical thinking or creativity, like, these are skills that will help an 8-year-old today.
sure.
So I think the work that I do, and going back to your question about my day to day, is educating parents and trying to convince them to be intentional about helping kids learn these skills.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, I can understand that in the sense that like right now, I think we're just on that cusp of, well, optimistically speaking, of maybe further change coming, hopefully. Um, there are conversations like this taking place, right? There's businesses like yours as well, not exactly the same, but businesses out there that do see this, or people, individuals, educators themselves who see this and recognize this. Now it just comes down to having these education systems kind of get in line, but just tracking history and how long that's taken, we can understand that it's probably going to take quite some time. So it's nice to have these options for parents, but I can imagine, yeah, the educational process of just getting them to fully understand and comprehend, the needs and the reasons for this could take a bit of time on your end or anyone's end who's trying to lead that charge.
Yeah, I mean, just last week, I saw an article in the papers that the Singapore government wants to introduce design thinking to the curriculum by 2050. 2050.
50,
Yeah,
2050.
that's my kids will be almost 40, right?
Yeah,
So this would be for what, my grandkids generation. Like,
yeah,
it's insane.
yeah.
So one thing I know for sure is that change is not going to happen fast enough for my kids. So
Mm,
to a very large extent, I do what I do at Doyobi and at Saturday Kids because my kids need to learn these skills. And
yeah.
if there are limited opportunities for them to learn these skills, then as an entrepreneur, I should solve my own problems, right?
Yeah, well said. Well said. Well, maybe we can kind of continue this sentiment, sharing of this sentiment into the next segment, something called a Q&A discovery. We can just kind of continue this back and forth. And the first question that I do have lined up does kind of continue on with what we were just speaking of. We've kind of spoke about some of these challenges within the current educational systems. And again, I think this is like, it's the world over, as I referenced off the top. But it's particularly I think strong or a bit of an issue in Asia in particular. I'm based here within Japan, and same thing, standardized tests. They rule the roost essentially, and parents are always, ultra concerned. Schools are ultra concerned for these scores, and we're just speaking to that point of that's not necessarily the most important thing. Now, in terms of what you're doing with Doyobi, maybe this might be a nice opportunity for you to share, what makes your business, unique, your platform unique. What value does it serve for parents, and of course, most importantly, for children?
Yeah, so the premise of Doyobi is that for kids to learn skills like critical thinking or collaboration, the most effective way is for them to actually apply and practice these skills. And so we work backwards from that, right? So we ask ourselves, what are the changes we want to see in the kids? So we
Mhm.
want them to be action oriented. We want them to have growth mindset. We want them to be global citizens, right? And then we figure out, how do we get kids to learn the skills and develop the mindsets that we want to see? And so what we've done is we create quests in the metaverse, and through these quests, kids have to apply critical thinking, or they have to work with other kids, or they have to be creative about solving a problem. And that's how they acquire these skills, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's actually not anything revolutionary, because this idea actually started in the Nordics. It's called live action role playing, LARP.
Mhm.
um, the difference, and it goes back to our earlier conversation about the definition of EdTech, right? Is
Mhm.
that LARP is not scalable. In order to do a LARP session, you need props, you need costumes, you need to have the space, and you can
Mhm.
only do it with the kids in the room, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what we've done in the metaverse is we basically have props, have costumes, have everything that you would do in an actual lab session, but in the virtual world. And we can make it accessible to any kid in the world. And I think that's what makes us special.
Agreed. Agreed. And in researching for this talk, that was one of the things that stood out immediately. And to add to all of this, you can tell me if I'm onto something or not. But I like as well how you're playing onto some or into something that is naturally attracting children, right? This notion of games and technology and being online, like those are things that kids want to do anyways these days. So if you're able to tie in like learning opportunities for them where they don't even know they're learning it in that moment, but they're taking on all these different life lessons and these skills through and through. Like that's when you've kind of struck gold, I would think. Is you
Yeah.
can hit that mark. And I'm assuming that's probably part of what you're aiming to. You're recognizing those things, what I was just speaking of. Am I into something there? Or?
Yeah, so the challenge is measuring these skills and
Yeah.
dispositions, right? So how do I prove to a parent that, hey, your child has gone from 50 to 80 in terms of her
Right.
ability to think critically? It's
Yeah.
very, very hard to measure, and it
Mm.
takes time. And also the other thing that parents kind of expect is that, it's a program and there's an endpoint. So they always ask, how long is the program, right? Like, how long does it take for my child to be a critical thinker? And the problem with that is it's non-binary, right? It's not
Yeah.
zero or one.
It's until you
It,
die, right? It's until you
exactly.
die. You're becoming a lifelong learner is what it is. We're shaping you into that. We're shaping your child into that.
Exactly. And I think an interesting point is that if parents actually thought critically, they would realize that whatever schools teaching their kids is doing nothing to prepare their child for the future where, jobs are being created all the time, and our kids will be working in jobs that don't exist today, right?
Yeah.
So in some ways, the inability of parents to even imagine that future
Mm,
is because they never learned to think critically, right? They
themselves.
just follow whatever the system is, and they
Yeah.
assume that this is the best path for their child. But if they really sat down and think about it, it's not true.
Yeah, that sounds quite familiar from what conversations that I've had or overheard here within Japan too. Very much similar in that sense, and probably elsewhere too, to be even clearer. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's it sheds a lot of light, I think, on some of the challenges that are faced right now, but then also too in terms of what Doyobi is all about and some of the opportunities there to kind of shift mindsets and establish some degree of change within this whole system. So I do have another question here. And again, in researching for this talk, I went back and, tried to find as much as I could. And on LinkedIn, I understand you're quite active there and sharing your passion and your ideas in terms of a lot of your thoughts and ideas towards education. And I found this one post in particular that I'd like to read off for listeners and for you, of course, as well. And then after, I'll ask you to comment. Now, let me just read that off for you right now. So you wrote, "I'm a product of Asian privilege. I went to the right school, made the right friends, built the right network. But privilege, by definition, only applies to the few. It's time to rethink the old boys, girls network and consider whether an individual's life options should be limited by what school they went to and who they met there." Now, I love this for a couple of reasons. One is just the authenticity, that it offers. And then two, it kind of feeds into this notion of passion that you have for, what you believe in as far as, education and specifically related to Doyobi. And maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to say through this post is that in future, the most important people you meet as a young person, as a teenager, they are not necessarily the people you went to school with. I think possibly they are the people that you built projects with, that you made things with, right? So going back to the definition of entrepreneurship and being an entrepreneur, it's about this maker mindset. So what if the most important people in your life as a 30-year-old are the people that you met in a Doyobi class when you were 12, right? And you spent 1 year working on this project that you think will address climate change or will address some form of inequality. That's really what I'm trying to say, because I don't necessarily believe that the people who go to the best school in this day and age are going to be the people who will be the most successful 20 years from now.
Yeah.
Simply because the education system is not evolving at the pace at which the world is changing, right? And we have already had this discussion that it's not going to evolve fast enough for our kids. So I think the premise here is that the people who will be successful 20 years from now will be the kids who grow up learning all these skills, right? And learning about themselves, having that self-awareness to understand what is it that is important to them, what do they want to spend their career doing, right? And not just going down this path because my parents went down that path and it's the path of least resistance. Right. And I think that's the trap that so many people fall into, right? So many of my peers, are doing something that, it's just what is expected as an Asian kid, right?
They're doing it to please
the
parents or to please somebody else, but it's not necessarily what they have a passion for. Yeah,
exactly that.
Yeah. I really like that as well, that post for the idea of just decentralization of education. It doesn't matter necessarily, how much money your parents have in their bank accounts. Like you said, I mean, the kids going through, a prep school that's, rather expensive that most people can't afford to get into might not be as best prepared, for the needs and wants of the future society. So somebody who's going into a program such as Doyobi or something similar, they're going to be learning the skills that are going to be required. And that offers a lot of opportunity for people who, can't get into these, again, elite schools. And I think that's a powerful sort of thought as well that I really like. It just sort of like levels the playing field, if you will.
Yeah. And I'm hearing stories of parents who went to elite schools who are now opting out of sending their kids to the same elite school, because they don't want their kids to be put in a pressure cooker environment, right? Where it's so focused on academic achievements that their kids have no time and space to do anything else. So these are the enlightened parents, right? And I guess a lot of my work is to convince more parents to think like that.
Well said. Yeah. Anecdotally, I'd just like to add as well, not too long ago, I came across a conversation. I myself have children as well. And there was somebody in my daughter's class who she's in grade 3. And there was one of her classmates, and the mother had said, "Oh yes, well we just pulled out so and so, the child's name from all of her extracurricular activities. She was doing piano, she was doing some sports, and the reason being is she has to get serious now and start studying harder. She's already going to school, obviously, but in Japan, I don't know if it's similar or not, but there's the cram school system within Japan too, where oftentimes parents will send their children to cram schools after the regular school completes for upwards of 2-3 hours. And the further they, age, get older, the longer that those cram school sessions go. They could be there 4 or 5 hours until 9, 10 at night. But probably for this child, the parents are going easy, maybe only 2 or 3 hours a night. But in grade 3, I think it was grade 3. Yeah, grade 3, they'd asked her to stop doing all of those fun activities so she could get serious and study, for her future. And it just broke my heart. It just broke my heart. I mean, all those extracurriculars completely devalued, but all the skills that are being involved in the development of that child, social relationships and, whatever else she's doing, whatever, skill that she's building in, say, piano or whatever it might be. I mean, it's a sad reflection on the state of education is what I'm trying to get at here. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, in Singapore, the funny thing is parents send their kids for extra piano classes because if you're really good at playing the piano,
Yeah.
it's a way to get into a good school. So it parents are not sending their kids for piano lessons because they want their kids to develop, an appreciation for music, right? It's
Yeah.
because there's this thing called direct schools admission, and what parents are after is the easiest or the most reliable way to get my kid into a good school.
Right.
So
Right.
it's no longer learning for the sake of learning, but learning for, this other goal, which is to get into the school.
Yeah. Yeah. God, we need change. We need change here, John. I do have another question here as well. And in terms of this whole world of EdTech, again, off the top, I'd reference some of the other things that you're involved with that are outside of EdTech. I'd like to know what pulled you into that world. What initially attracted you to it all?
Yeah, so I was really bored at school. Like from a young age, right? I just knew that whatever I was learning in school has very little relevance to the real world. And so, now that I'm a dad and I see what my kids are going through, it's the exact same thing, right? And I just feel like that's not right. Like kids should love learning, right? It's something that they should be excited about rather than something they dread. And if you ask, any kid in Singapore, in fact, in most countries, whether they like learning, they just associate learning with studying for the sake of taking an exam, right? And that's just wrong. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to fix.
And so you to maybe paraphrase a little bit, you saw EdTech as maybe one way or one medium or vehicle to kind of advance that agenda or that cause that you feel so passionately about. Would that be a correct?
Yeah, exactly right. So how do we use technology to help kids learn better? And when I say learn better, I don't mean, learn like math or calculus or chemistry more effectively, but
Yeah.
to help them learn what is important and what is meaningful, not just in terms of skills and dispositions, but also in terms of learning about themselves, right? How do they uncover what they are good at? How do they uncover what they are passionate about? And how do they find that purpose? Because I don't believe that you need to be in your 30s to start thinking about your purpose, right? Like what you really want to do in life. I think this is something that a young person, can start thinking about already. And the problem with many societies is that for a very long time, parents have told their kids that your purpose is to study hard to get into a good school, right? So, and that's sort of what my understanding of purpose was when I was a kid, right?
Yeah.
And it just makes no sense. Like
Hmm.
it makes no sense to tell a child that the reason for your existence as a young person is to study hard. Like
Yeah.
and so many kids because of that don't have a childhood, right? I
Hmm.
saw a TikTok video a couple of days ago of this girl. She must be 8 or 9 in China, and she was
Hmm.
crying and she was basically having an argument with her father about all the studying time that she has to do. And she's like, why don't I deserve playtime? Why don't I deserve,
Yeah.
space to be a child?
Yeah.
And this is coming from an 8-year old, right? It's just
Yeah.
heartbreaking.
It is. It really is. And yeah, God, I hope we can move this agenda forward and instill change. Because at least like I'm finding, and probably for you too. I mean, you're much more embedded within that world. Obviously, with your enterprise with Doyobi, you're probably speaking to a lot of people too. And we focus to this point on a lot of parents, perhaps, or conversations of people that or conversations with people that don't necessarily get it. But I'm guessing as well that you've spoken to people that are equally passionate about advancing this cause. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, so like just before this call, I spoke to an educator. She runs an outfit called Imagine If, and it's basically a micro school that provides bespoke education for every single learner.
Wow.
So the starting point is always about what does this child want? What's best for the child? And
Yeah.
then the educators at Imagine If will design a curriculum or a plan for this child, right? And
Yeah.
I really do think that's the way education should be.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's hard to do at scale and it's impossible to do in a traditional school.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess that's where technology comes in, right? So
Hmm.
again, going back to EdTech, I just wish that EdTech is used for a better purpose,
Yeah.
to create these sort of bespoke learning journeys rather than to help kids learn calculus more effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really, really good point and worth re-mentioning. So thank you for doing so. I do have one last question in this segment, and this is a little bit more broad in general, kind of not referencing only, EdTech and Doyobi, but in reference to all that you do. Again, you seem like a pretty busy guy. And personally, I mean, it'd be fascinating to know what drives you forward, in terms of all of this. Is this something that you can kind of like tangibly connect to experiences growing up, or is this something that is just subconscious and you're not even sure what the reasons is, what motivates you and pushes you or propels you forward?
Yeah, so at the Obama Foundation, we have a saying, we are the ones,
Mm,
right? So we are the ones who will make the change we want to see.
mm,
And that's really what drives me, right? I'm very clear about what change I want to see.
yeah,
And I know that it's a very long shot and it's going to take a long time. And, I'm going to have to convince millions of parents. But I know that I want to see kids thrive, right? And I want to see kids have a childhood. I want to see kids enjoy learning.
yeah.
And because I have such a clear um, outcome in mind, that
Hmm.
drives me.
Mm,
And I think that's exactly what I'm hoping to give kids, right? To have that very clear goal or very clear outcome so that they know what they're working towards. And whatever they're spending their time on, they are very clear that they know why they're doing it.
right, right. And that kind of links back up in terms of ed tech, even on, one of the attractive points of it is scalability, I suppose as well, and being able to reach, like you said, those numbers, whether it's, hundreds of thousands or millions of people eventually, like if you can get your ideas across or your platform across and enough people to buy in, that's how change occurs, as you know, and as I well know. So yeah, it's encouraging in that sense. And that's exactly what we need. I mean, we need people like you pushing, advancing these agendas forward and conversations like these, quite frankly, that can expose these ideas to more people. So yeah. All right. Well, maybe this is a nice point to shift into this middle segment, something called a water cooler story. And here I just ask guests to indulge listeners with the story relating to their profession. So I'm really eager to hear what you have for us today, John.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that came to mind when I was a teenager, um, at around age 14, 15. I was really into football and I wanted to be a professional footballer. Um, and that's really difficult in Singapore, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't really have a professional league, and also we have to do national service, right? So 2 years of conscription in the prime of a young footballer.
Right, right.
So and also, Chinese parents, there's no way they would have let me pursue that.
Yeah.
Um, and then and I when I got a bit older, at around 17 or 18, I really wanted to be a film director
Mm,
because I really got into films, right? And I don't mean like Hollywood blockbusters, but
hmm.
I got into like art house films and indie films.
Okay.
So I really wanted to be a film director. And my dad was like, I'll pay for you to go to the UK to study economics, but not film. So, I'm an economics graduate.
Yeah.
But the point of this story is that I think there's tremendous value in helping young people understand themselves, right? Understand what is it that drives them, or understand, what is it that they are really interested in. And I think, Ken Robinson shared a similar story about I forget her name now. I think Gillian Ted is her name. She basically is one of the best producers of musicals, right? And as a child, her teachers all thought that she is incapable because it's like asking a fish to climb a tree, right? So I I really, really wish that parents will give kids the time and space to learn about themselves. I think that's really the most important thing you can do for a young person. But
Hmm.
then most families and most parents just see this one path and they just sort of push the kids down that one path, right? And kids, because they haven't learned to think critically, they haven't learned to question, they just go down that path
Yeah.
because it's what their parents expect of them.
Yeah, it's exposure, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it really comes down to exposure to new ideas and new possibilities, new opportunities. And like you said, if they're not allowed to kind of explore and interact with these different opportunities that are everywhere, everywhere all around them, then they are missing out on who they could be. And ultimately, I mean, society misses out on all of that too. Or
Yeah.
placing kids potentially in the wrong professions where they could be, elsewhere and doing so much more good and advancing, the human race, the human species in so many different ways. But it's a bit of a net loss, I think, at times due to some of these issues that you were just speaking of. I think that was really well said. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I guess many more young people need to listen to life as you know,
Yeah, thanks. I like that plug. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, well, I'm glad you brought that up. But that is something that I feel, equally passionate about as well. And I think it is part of this, learning from others and hearing their stories and some of their challenges and also opportunities that they can take this idea here and shift it and mold it and change it into something else that applies to them and where they're at in their life or where they're at contextually, the country that they live in, the culture that they're part of. That's where ideas start from. You know that as well as I do. And yeah, I think all of it is interconnected here. And if we can just allow for these children to have these opportunities, we can really start making some changes. So yeah, no, great story there. And thanks for sharing that. We are heading into the last segment here, John. It's something called a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future, usually it's trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And I'd be curious to know a little bit about what you're hearing within, say, EdTech or within education as a whole. Obviously, the Metaverse, which you're quite familiar with, obviously with Doyobi. Maybe even there's chatter with Web3, decentralization of education, all these different things. But, as someone who is truly embedded in it, all what are people talking about right now specifically?
Well, I mean, the truth is that at least in Southeast Asia, EdTech is still very much focused on academic performance, right?
Mm,
And so what I'm seeing is startups or founders or entrepreneurs that are using technology to help learning core academic subjects more effective. And that's actually something I struggle with as an investor, because the space that I primarily invest in is the future of work and learning.
yeah,
And the problem is that because almost all edtech in Southeast Asia is focused on academic help, I can't find anything to invest in. And so, in terms of what I think the future should look like, I think there needs to be many more startups that are about helping kids find their interests and passions.
yeah,
Startups that are about helping kids develop certain skills, right? Actually another problem with Doyobi is that it's very hard for me to explain to a parent what Doyobi is,
yeah,
because we don't exist in a category, right?
yeah.
Um,
Well,
like
yeah, I mean, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, like, if you ever have to explain, well, what is the metaverse to somebody who doesn't know the metaverse, or what is Web3 if you don't know Web3, or blockchain, if you're trying to explain any of those concepts to somebody who's never heard of them is an absolute nightmare. So I can imagine that trying to explain, like your business being based in one of those elements and how they're all sort of interconnected, it would be a massive challenge. But
Yeah,
sorry to
and
interrupt
also
there.
the learning outcomes, right? What kids
Yeah,
learn.
yeah, you'd
Just
mentioned it.
yesterday we got an award from an organization called Holland IQ. We were selected as one of the top 50 ed tech startups in Southeast Asia,
Well,
and
congratulations.
and they placed us in the category STEAM, right?
Oh, yeah.
But we're not STEAM, right?
Right.
That's not what
Right.
we do.
Yeah.
And the problem is that they don't have a category for us, right? There's no category on for life skills for kids or transferable
Yeah.
skills for kids. Actually, a friend of mine, she said the category for Doyobi should be powers and smarts, right? Like,
Nice. I like that.
but a different kind of smarts,
Yeah.
non-academic smarts, street
Yeah.
smarts.
Yeah. 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 Well, I think it's another thing to add to your list. I think you need to start some sort of organization or some sort of foundation that they promote sort of those values and ideals. And create your own award, perhaps. But okay. Well, yeah, maybe on all of this note that we've been speaking of here, John, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think listeners are really going to come away armed with a lot more, better understanding one of what's going on out there within that space, especially within EdTech and Doyobi in particular. But hopefully, it allows for this agenda to move forward. So again, yeah, thanks so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Now, for those interested in learning more about John and his work, you can find out more at doyobi.com. You can also find him personally on LinkedIn, Twitter, and he does have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And for reference, all of this information will be included in the show notes. And two, you can share, this episode. I mean, again, drawing a reference to what I was just speaking of, the more that we can kind of put these ideas in front of people, all the better for advancing these types of agendas. You can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcast. And if you have some time, head on over to YouTube. We will have a video conversation of the talk today there. And the interesting thing is we'll have an image overlay with images relating to the actual talk. So you can kind of take it in a different manner. And finally, don't forget to tune in to the next episode of Life as A, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.